Hello everybody, welcome back to the Advanced Vape channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at the CHURCHILL RTA from E-APOTHECARY. That's a Canadian company. As far as I know, this is their first RTA, or at least the first one that I've seen. So I'll go on and take it off and we'll talk about the design of it. It's a fairly unique design. And it's pretty much almost entirely Ultim. The entire atomizer is based around this Ultim section that goes from here all the way into the top. And I'll take it apart to show you what I mean. This is the top cap coming off. The threads are nice and smooth, but I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So there's an O-ring holding, kind of adding tension to that there, and then that just comes off. And it's just one entire Ultim piece here. There's your top fill. The drip tip comes out, and that's basically the foundation of the tank, is this Ultim piece. And the base screws into that as well. And you've got this removable chimney section that just pops off. That's being held on by an O-ring there. And you're left with basically a postless deck with one center airflow, and it kind of has little wings off to the side. And that's it. So on here, obviously I have two coils. It seems to me like it's sort of designed around going for single coil. You can have the coil just laying across the airflow, basically in the same orientation that these dual coils are, except one in the middle there. And I'll talk about my impressions of that. I've tried the single coil on this previously, and I'll talk about that a little bit more when I go to actually use this. As you can see, it has a huge airflow slot. It's kind of hard to turn the airflow with it taken apart, but yeah, absolutely massive air inlet there. So a lot more air than you think would be coming through this kind of tiny center air. It's very airy, and it comes with, you can take this off of here, and it comes with a second ring that's kind of 4 smaller holes to choke it down a little bit. And I very much prefer this one to the other one. So that's what it looks like with the 4 hole airflow all the way open. And yeah, to me this works much better than the wide open one. And again, I'll talk about that once we go to actually use it. So before we even go through the dry fire and all of that kind of stuff, I just want to spend a quick second to talk about kind of the core design feature of this tank, and something that I personally, it's like a pet peeve for me. I really don't like when tanks use anything that relies on metal threading into plastic or Ultim or Delrin, anything like that. So these threads are fairly sturdy, but it's still Ultim threading onto metal. So if you cross thread it or in some way thread it incorrectly, it's done. It's over with. The metal has torn up the plastic. And that has already been an issue for me. If you can tell, this center chimney section, it is also threaded. Sorry. It is also threaded into that top cap at the very top there. I'm waiting for it to focus. So it's threaded into threads underneath there. And when I was doing my first build on it, this just kind of popped out of there. The chimney fell out, and it really, really did not want to thread back in there. I thought that the threads were broken, or it was just kind of done for. I kept working with it and ended up having to use quite a bit of force to get it back in there. So I'm not actually sure if it's in there how it's supposed to be, or if I just kind of force the threads to make it work. I know that the alignment is right how it's supposed to be, but yeah, I'm not sure if me having to kind of push it back in there forcefully, if it was supposed to be like that or not. So I had a lot of trouble getting that back in there, and that just kind of reinforces my feeling about metal threading onto Ultim. I don't like it at all. Another thing to note, this O-ring down here was bouncing all over the place. So when I first got the tank, I took this off and it pulled the O-ring with it, and I didn't notice that and moved the O-ring up here. So me having to seat this O-ring back down, it did not want to seat on there properly. So if you get this tank and you notice that this O-ring has moved, be very careful putting it back down on there. It's supposed to look like this, where the bottom of the Ultim is over top of the O-ring. But for me, when I was threading it down there, the O-ring was sort of just sitting there and the tank was sitting on top of it, and it was not threading properly on there. And that made me very, very worried that I was going to cross thread it or thread it wrong, and that would be it for the Ultim. Okay, so the build that I have on here is a small framed staple build with an alien wrap over it. As you can see, I went with 4 wraps. It's a wide wire, but the width of the deck here kind of seriously limits the width of the coils that you can do. So I could have, it's a 3mm diameter, and that's about as much as you want to go with. I mean, I guess I could have gone bigger or smaller on the diameter, but the actual width of the coil, the number of wraps, it's pretty close to limited how this is. I could probably fit 5 in there, but it would be a very tight squeeze. And surprisingly, it's kind of the same with single coil, because you're still kind of dealing with this width rather than this width. So you're really limited on the number of wraps that you can do with this tank just because of how it's designed. Okay, so let's go on and get through the dry fire really quick, and then we'll talk about wicking. Okay, so kind of the concept of wicking this is that both coils, or if you're doing single coil, it's just one entire section here, and the chimney sits down on top of it, and you have these 2 gigantic kind of wicking slots there. So it's quite a bit more tricky with dual coil than it is with single. With single, it was pretty cut and dry. I didn't have any issues with it. With the dual, it takes a little bit of work, and I'll say this right away. Kendo Gold does not work well in this RTA. It wicks too fast. The Kendo is just a little bit too thin, and juice flows too easily for these gigantic kind of wicking holes. So I would definitely not recommend using Kendo Gold on this. For me, Cotton Bacon works much better, so that's what I'm going to be using today. So I generally cut it right about at that O-ring, and I'm just kind of pulling them into kind of where they're one piece now instead of 2 separate strands. This tank was advertised as one of the easiest wicking RTAs out there, and if you know from reviews that I've done in the past, normally when a tank or a company says that about a tank, it makes me very skeptical. Makes me feel like it's going to be the opposite. And this is not the hardest tank to wick out there, but it is just a little bit finicky. So from this point, I pretty much always put juice on the wicks before I position them. Okay, and now I'm just kind of putting them in these little slots here. There's kind of a little impression into the metal. And you definitely want it to be thickest in the middle like that, how I'm kind of squeezing it together. Because that's where the wick holes are. Okay, from here I put this down on there. And really important, I always hold a light so that I can see if there's light coming through there, and there is just a little bit here. If you see more light than that coming through there, it's going to leak like crazy. This one is okay. It's okay if there's a little bit of light coming through, and I might move it just a little bit so it's a little bit more even. And from here, the chimney seats down into the kind of upper chimney there, and then it screws on. And you want to make sure those threads are all the way seated and the O-ring is covered up, but you don't want to over tighten it because of those ultim threads. So you got to be a little bit careful. This juice opening is very small, so I was just kind of going a little too fast and it started to come off the other side. You need to be very careful not to thread it incorrectly. So if it's threading right, it's nice and smooth. And now we're ready to open the airflow and give it a try. So I'm going to be using this at 100 watts. It's wicking very fast, and this tank is kind of weird. So if you leave it sit for a while or something like that, it's almost like the pressure in it equalizes, and the very first time that you vape it, it's really dry and the flavor is not there. And then because these channels are so big, it's like it pulls a bunch of juice in there, and the second one and after that, it just gets more and more saturated. So it takes a second to kind of build up to the maximum amount of saturation that it has. And it's not as much if you're refilling it or doing it the first time like I just did as if you leave it sit for an hour or two or whatever and come back to it later. So to me, it's still pretty airy with this kind of restricted thing on there. Not nearly as airy as it is with this on there. This makes it very airy in dual coil. But the kind of strange thing to me is if you put it in single coil, I was expecting it to be a little bit more restricted, but it's actually a lot more restricted air. With that coil sitting on top of that airflow, it gets to be a lot more restricted. So more restricted than the reload. It turns into a very restrictive type vape. The flavor is still good, but for me, I prefer the dual coil. And this is kind of the perfect amount of restricted air for my personal preference. So the flavor on this is actually very good. And I find myself just being kind of frustrated with this tank because I really hate the ultim threads thing. It's just a pet peeve of mine. And the wicking is really kind of finicky for dual coil. And I'm not really happy with how limited you are on the number of wraps you can do. So all of those things just make me a little bit frustrated because the tank has really good flavor and really good performance once you have it set up how you like. So for me, that took a while of working with it and re-wicking it over and over again to figure out a way that works for me. So I tried putting tons and tons of cotton in there, and it took a long time to kind of build up to a saturation level that I was happy with like that. And I tried using not a whole lot of cotton, and then it just leaks like crazy and it's super oversaturated. So there's a really fine line there for me, like a lot of RTAs out there. As you can see, it goes through juice really quickly, which is kind of something I would expect for a tank that has really good flavor. That's just kind of how it goes. So yeah, I really like the flavor, but the other things about this, they just kind of bother me. This is an $85 tank is what I paid for it. And for an $85 tank, I don't understand why I have threads in the Ultim. I'm starting to get over the kind of Ultim tank thing. I know that a lot of tanks are doing it, and tanks that I like have done it. But the threads into the plastic thing, that's really hard for me to personally overcome. It's one of those tanks that has really good flavor, but the other stuff about it just gets to me. So if you have it set up how you like, then it'll keep doing well, you know. You can just keep using it how it is. But if you have to change something, and like if you first get it, there's that learning curve where you're going to have to work with a little bit to get it how you like. It's really not one of those tanks where you just get it out and it immediately works how you want it to. At least that's how it was for me. So really, it's a tank with really good flavor that just has a couple things about it that bother me, and you'll just have to make the decision for yourself as to whether or not that's worth $85. It does perform really well once you have it set up how you like it. So I'm not trying to say that it's a bad tank, because it's really not. It's just one of those tanks that has issues, and you need to be really careful with the threads at the top and at the bottom. But if you're willing to overlook that, it's a good choice for a smaller kind of premium RTA. I plan to keep using it. I don't regret buying it. I'm not sure that I would buy it again if something happened to these threads, just because that's such a pet peeve of mine. Anyway, overall, really good flavor. If you don't do really crazy builds on it, I think it will work really well for you. So that'll bring us to the end of this video about the Churchill RTA from E-APOTHECARY. If you like this video on our channel, give us a like and subscribe. And as always, if you have any questions, leave them below in the comments or send me an email. Thanks.